books, geometry books, are conglomerations of proofs, which we usually teach very well by progressing through them in order where you build a foundation and then go to the progress on to the higher, more complex ones, which depend on earlier proofs. So there's a natural order for learning anything like that, and so I would I would make another pass through the book and maybe go halfway through it and then go a quarter of the way through it and then concentrate on the first chapter and then jump to the first lesson. That's how I would begin a college textbook when I was a young child, and it ended up being a very very efficient way to learn. And so here I'm stuck in this economics class in high school, and what happens is I get the textbook. It's as thick as any mathematics book I ever got, and I thumb through it, and it's entirely bereft of formal proof and theorem. And I paid attention to economics even since I was practically an infant, and it was, to me, very, very odd that you're going to teach something which is supposed to be a science and yet is wholly bereft of formal proof and theorem. And I thought, of course, that economics had something wrong with it. It was, it was preposterous. It was unfathomable. That is, it had no beginning. It had no structure which was self-evident. And it turns out there's a reason why, and the reason is it's not only bereft of formal proof and theorem, it's comprised of highly devised lies which are intended to deceive the public. And it takes not a genius mathematician's mind, but it does take the diligence of an accountant to unravel what's actually going on. And what happened in this course is, I browsed through the textbook like I usually did, and it was completely unchallenging material. What my problem with it is that there was no reason to believe any of it. It was as if it was just stated as it was, and you were simply to believe that. And in fact, many parts of it were obviously false. And so I endured the first, say, 2 weeks of this course, and one day I just kind of had enough, and I don't mean in a temperamental way. It's just that I'm a critical thinker. We all should be critical thinkers, and if we're being asked to just imprint stupidly, without thinking, without examination, there's something wrong there, especially in a free country, and especially when that free country depends on a true, actual economic system for its freedom. So we got to this point in this class, and the man who taught it, I really actually liked the teacher. His name was Mr. Otto, and he was a fine gentleman. He really was. He wasn't quite the critical thinker that I was, or he probably wouldn't have been teaching economics. But what happened, one day is he taught the definitions of inflation and deflation as, quote, increases or decreases in circulation per goods and services. And I do like to refine the definition somewhat, but basically the idea is that it's an increase in circulation or a decrease in circulation, that is inflation and deflation respectively, in relation to the property that the circulation is to represent. He no sooner teaches this definition than he launches into not an explanation, not a teaching, there's a difference, but a mere assertion that inflation causes increasing prices, which Oh, not long afterward, we now very confusedly use the two as the same. We say that I give separate terms for price inflation and circulatory inflation. He defines circulatory inflation, and basically he's trying to say it's the same as price inflation. And as I say, I had about enough. I mean, that just doesn't even make sense, that if you would increase the circulation, that all prices would just go up to our detriment somehow. In other words, you get to the butcher store and it's was 50 cents a chicken, and you got a raise. Your employer doubled your salary, so when you walk in the door, the butcher senses it somehow and says, well, chicken's for $1 a piece for you, And I mean, it just makes no sense. As if we're listening, why don't we prosper twice as much instead of raising our prices twice, so as would preclude us realizing prosperity? I mean, it's actually a hideous idea. It's stupid. It's yes. Utterly, it's banal. It's so mediocre to not even raise your hand and challenge it. And I had enough. My hand shot up in the air, and I said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Otto, but that just doesn't make any sense to me." And I'm going to have to shorten this explanation up for your hour show. But the thing is, I said, first of all, how is it even possible to have circulatory inflation? If, as you say, all money comes into circulation as a debt, which is collateralized, how is it possible to ever loan more money into circulation than property, than represented property? And he started to turn red in the face, and he stood there for a while thinking, and finally he answered me. He knew that I'm this kid who proves the Pythagorean theorem off the top of his head. He's really, reluctant to challenge me, and he thought about it, and finally he looked up at me and he says, "By God, I think you're right." I says, furthermore, if all this money is a debt subject to interest, then there's an implicit obligation for us to maintain a vital circulation, because we're going to be paying principal and interest out of a circulation which is at most comprised of so much principal. And so, in order to continue servicing the initial debts, we're going to have to borrow back into circulation principal and interest as an ever greater sum of debt, which is perpetually increased so much as periodic interest on an ever greater sum of debt. Thus, the sum of debt is going to even escalate I'm just thinking off the top of my head as I throw this all at my teacher. Thus, the sum of debt is going to increase at an ever escalating rate until we reach a terminal sum of debt, which would involve the entire circulation just to service it. And this would destroy our creditworthiness to borrow further, as would be necessary to maintain a vital circulation. And being as the sum of debt is going to be so much more than the circulation, therefore, and we can't borrow enough to maintain the circulation, therefore our payments would immediately deflate the circulation. We couldn't sustain our industry, and we would collapse. Therefore, as all the while, ever more of every unit of the circulation is being dedicated to servicing debt versus sustaining the higher prices that industry is going to have to charge to maintain margins of solubility. Yet, the fact that the money is dedicated to servicing debt instead of sustaining industry, how is it even possible for the prices to rise as a consequence either? And isn't it instead then the interest which causes increasing prices? And he looked at me, his jaw just dropped, and he turned redder and redder and redder, and he says, "By God, I think you're right again." And so this was the beginning of it for me, and so I don't follow in the pattern of anyone else. I mean, today so many people think that it's obvious that there's something wrong with interest, but they don't realize that what happened is I wrote papers and I spoke about mathematically perfected economy practically from that time. I mean, I left the class realizing that there was a mathematically perfected economy, that if inflation and deflation are defined as increases or decreases in circulation per goods and services as he had defined it, then only one thing and one thing only solved inflation and deflation, and that is a eradication of interest in conjunction with an obligatory schedule of payment which pays the principal only out of circulation, retires it from circulation at the rate in which you consume of the related property. So, in fact, that's what mathematically perfected economy is. That's all it is an eradication of interest, which solves the third of the usual three categoric faults as I give them. It took me, several months to resolve that any obfuscation of economy such as this suffers basically three categoric faults. And there was a lot of thinking and work involved in doing this, but that ability to do that is a milestone from which you can actually prove a fact of one and one only mathematically perfected economy. So the three categoric faults, I'll just state them. We don't have time to go into the arguments, and they're pretty obvious, what they are. And the first is inflation and deflation. But I add another thing to that, a term that I call maladisposition, and the listeners have to understand that anyone who dissects, processes to resolve what's going wrong with them has to develop terminology which explicitly indicates each distinct part of a process. And so it's never good enough to say inflation when you're talking about two things, circulatory inflation or price inflation, which are two completely different things.
Right.
You see, so you have to give these terms to the development of a discipline. And basically, I realized, when I went home from school this day, I was 16, that it's kind of weird to put this into perspective for people. It's hard to do in a few words. But the thing is, I realized it was a very important thing, but I didn't ever think that it would be my life's work. I didn't ever think, because it's a simple mathematic problem. It's kind of like, you're scratching your head, and somebody threw a word problem at you, and I was always just excellent at resolving mathematic problems. You give me a mathematic problem, I can tell you right how to solve it, So, anyway, I knew this was important, but I didn't realize how important, really, at the time. But I realized it was important for me to understand it, and I realized that it was important that others understand it. And at first, I suppose I really assumed that if I understood it, then I could connect with the few, evidently, who might ever have understood it before me, because it wasn't evident that anyone understood it before me. And in fact, my later history in this, is for a while is a process of discovering, how much others had resolved before me. In any case, I go home from school one day, and what happens is, I think in my sleep, and I'm thinking on this, and I resolve it into its parts, and I actually had mathematically perfected economy, the very idea of it, in school when I asked these questions to this teacher. But I take that idea home, and then I ruminate on it. You can't have, like in a in a revelatory moment, you can't just like say, this is the answer.
Right.
Any diligent person subjects it to all the tests that it needs to be subjected to find the holes in it. I mean, it's amazing. I've been doing this for 42 years, and somebody who hears about it for 15 seconds thinks they can ask a question that's never been asked before and hasn't been answered. I mean, it's ridiculous what we've devolved to in terms of inability or indisposition to understand this. But anyway, my main problem was resolving these categoric faults. And so I developed these. I understand that there's 3 categoric faults as a matter of a very intensive process of recognizing patterns and then realizing what the patterns actually are. This is part of this terminology thing, and